Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 18 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of predominantly classic cars with a few vintage cars thrown in there as well. And in this particular pick, we're featuring a vehicle which is one of the classics which, from what I've seen, online racing and in my personal use as well, tends to be one of the classics which is a little bit easier to overlook. But at the same time, it's actually a potentially very worthwhile classic to have in your collection. And the car is the Ferrari 512 BB. The BB standing for Berlinetta Boxer. And the real part that you want to hone in on there is the Boxer part, because this is one of those classic Ferraris which used what I believe to be a really cool engine layout. An engine layout which is pretty much monopolised these days by Subaru and Porsche, and that is of course the Boxer engine, or flat engine layout. This Ferrari is a flat 12. Ferrari used to use quite a few flat engines. They don't anymore, which is kind of a shame. And flat engines have some very specific advantages and also some potential disadvantages. Now, one of the main advantages that a Boxer or flat engine gives you is that the centre of gravity of the engine and the position that it sits under the car's hood or bonnet is much lower, because of the fact that it's much more compact in terms of height. So the centre of gravity of the car will be much lower, which reduces body roll through corners and also makes the car run smoother, because you don't get that side-to-side rock that a car would typically have when you rev the engine. Now, the revving part doesn't make as much of a difference. That just makes the car run smoother and have a more silky sound, which you can typically hear when you listen to a Subaru. The main advantage, though, is that lower centre of gravity, which really improves cornering compared to a conventional engine. The disadvantages, though, are, although it's more compact height-wise, they're typically wider than a normal engine. So the car itself may need to be wider than a typical vehicle. Now, in the case of the Subaru and Porsches, they don't use large capacity flat engines. The Subaru's only a 2 litre, Porsches tend to be around 3 or 4 litres, so they're not really massive engines, so they can keep the size relatively compact in terms of width. The Ferraris, though, are a bit larger. This particular model is a 4.9 litre, which is quite a large flat engine, especially when you don't see any flat engines that large these days anymore, which I personally think is kind of a shame. Another potential downside, and this is one which doesn't really affect the car in the game but does in real life, is that flat engines can sometimes be more awkward to work on in terms of maintenance, servicing, etc. Because everything is so much more flattened out, it can, on certain vehicles, be more difficult to carry out certain tasks with maintenance, say oil changes, that kind of thing. On the game, though, that doesn't really affect the car at all. Well, it doesn't affect the car at all, which is cool. You only get to see, really, the advantages. And that's one of the great things about playing a racing game. They allow you to really get the full use of the advantages of a car, which you may not get the chance to use in real life. Say, its full performance, as an example. Now, this particular Ferrari, as I said, is kind of an underappreciated model to some degree, but also, in my opinion, a potentially very useful one. Now, we've discussed the engine at length. It's also a very powerful engine. Despite being naturally aspirated, it puts out 632 horsepower fully tuned and 518 foot-pounds of torque, which is very high for a Ferrari. Ferraris don't typically have a huge amount of torque, but that is another advantage of a Boxer engine. They are typically very torquey. As far as weight, the car's reasonably good. It's not an overly small car, so the weight of 1152 kilos is pretty respectable. It puts out 549 horsepower per tonne, which is certainly very good for a classic. And the PP, when fully tuned, is, I would say, quite reasonable. 578 certainly isn't too high for this car, but at the same time it acknowledges well how good the car can be. Now, in terms of value for money, well, let's get into that a bit more, because the price on this car is one of the best attributes that it has in its favour. This car costs 102 grand. Now that sounds like a lot, and compared to some other vehicles, it is. You can certainly get faster cars for that price or less. But for a classic, especially a classic Ferrari, that is really, really reasonable. 102 grand is actually not that much when you think of how much many of the other Ferraris cost on the game. Compare that, for instance, to the 365 GTB, which costs significantly more, to say the least. In terms of straight-line performance, though, this car is actually up there with the best of them. It doesn't necessarily have the power of something like an old-school Chaparral or the old-school GT40s, but it does have very strong performance from the power that it has to work with. The top speed on this car is around 250 miles per hour or more, depending on your gearing, and that is impressive. In fact, that's actually faster than some of the new Ferraris on the game. So not bad at all for a classic. It certainly pulls its weight in terms of being a useful car. The acceleration is also very, very good, and it sounds pretty nice as well. If you're a fan of classic looking Ferraris, you certainly won't be disappointed. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the look of many older Ferraris, but this car certainly isn't ugly. In terms of handling, which is always the potential grey area for a classic exotic, it's workable. It's certainly nowhere near being the best handling of classics, but in its fully tuned form especially, it definitely handles itself very well. Given how much power it has to work with, it's a car which on the right track, especially for its power, can be a weapon to have at your disposal. So I definitely recommend checking this car out, and that's it for this episode, so I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.